Sandra Siegel was a struggling single mom when she met Mike Barajas.
He caught her eye, and one thing led to another. They ended up getting married.
Together, they built a comfortable life for Sandra's 2 daughters.
He raised them. He gave them everything that they needed.
Even if it meant letting them move back in as adults.
I don't think there was more than a year when they had the house to themselves.
They seemed to be happy, just like any typical American family.
But after almost 30 years together, Sandra and Mike's marriage would come to a tragic end.
All I can tell you is that we have an unknown deceased victim in the house.
Oh my God!
Was Mike the victim of a violent crime spree?
Colorado Springs was having a rash of home invasions and burglaries.
Or was it, as his brothers suspected, an inside job?
I said the only enemies he has is his stepdaughter and her friends.
But was that tension toxic enough to end in murder?
I don't have nothing to hide.
Or would the confession of an admitted criminal break the case wide open?
I told you I'd take his ass out.
He was worth more dead than he was alive.
And expose the one person no one suspected.
She was not a person of interest.
That was the love of your life at one time. It's just unimaginable.
Colorado Springs, Colorado, February 13th, 2013. It was the day before Valentine's Day in the city of 400,000 at the foot of the Rockies' spectacular Front Range.
It's a beautiful area. It's not utopia, but it's always been very pleasant and very calm and very quiet.
But at around 7 o'clock that Wednesday evening, Colorado Springs 911 received a worried call from one of the city's sprawling suburbs.
Our back door is open and the front room is all messed up.
The call came in as a burglary in progress.
The caller was 33-year-old Dawn Richburg.
Do you think that someone broke into your house? It does look like it.
Even more worrying, her stepfather, 47-year-old Miguel Mike Barajas, was supposed to be home.
I'm yelling, Daddy, and I'm not getting no response.
She said she saw a light on over by their mom and dad's bedroom. So she started walking towards there, and she stopped when she saw all of the bedding, sheets, everything pushed off onto the floor.
For all their sheets to be pulled off the bed like that, that's not normal.
She said she stopped, she got scared, and called us.
While sheriff's deputies converged on the scene, the dispatcher ordered Dawn out of the house for her own safety.
We're not sure if somebody's in the house or not.
And when the deputies arrived a few minutes later, they rushed into the house, guns drawn.
Anytime we're clearing a house, we have our weapons out.
What they found inside suggested a break-in.
There was stuff thrown all over the place and gone through.
But the ransacked rooms weren't all the officers found.
One of the first things they noticed was the spray painting in the house.
It looked to us like it was gang graffiti.
And when they looked inside the master bedroom, they found it exactly as Dawn described.
Blankets were all over the floor, and everything looked in disarray.
I yelled for Mr. Baraja, and I didn't receive a response. I took a closer look, and I saw a boot and a pant leg sticking out of the bedding.
It was Mike, and he was dead.
He was cold to the touch. He appeared to have been deceased for a while.
And when Sandra Barajas, Mike's wife of almost 30 years, rushed to the scene moments later, the news would send the 52-year-old widow collapsing into tears.
All I can tell you is that we have an unknown deceased victim in the house.
Oh my God! Mommy!
Born in 1960, Sandra Siegel spent her early years in El Paso, Texas, where she grew up to be a brash and outspoken teen.
She was very blunt, and she just said what came to her mind.
Her direct nature and occasionally bitter tongue didn't deter the boys, though. Sandra dated steadily through high school, got married soon after graduation, and gave birth to her daughter Dawn in 1979.
She was a happy-going girl. She liked to play.
A few years later, Sandra gave birth to a second daughter, but her marriage ended in divorce soon after.
He moved back with his family, and she kept the 2 girls.
And by her mid-20s, Sandra was still in El Paso, raising 2 children alone and barely making ends meet.
She had a job at a local, like a convenience store, gas station.
It was just a job to pay the bills, but it would end up changing the struggling single mom's life for the better, because that El Paso convenience store was where she met Mike Barajas. Born in 1965, Miguel Mike Barajas was the oldest of 4 brothers in a military family.
We traveled all over. We moved a lot. It seems like every 3 years. And that just kind of brought us all close together.
Being the oldest brother, he was left to babysit us a lot, so he never let us step out or, get out of control.
He was firm, but he was fair. He always watched out for us everywhere we went.
After graduating high school in 1983, he followed in his father's footsteps and joined the Army.
Once he graduated basic training, he was stationed down in Fort Bliss, Texas.
It was while living off base at Fort Bliss that he first met Sandra.
Every morning, he would stop at a gas station to fill up his car or to get a drink or something, and she worked there at the gas station, so that's kind of where they met.
I guess he caught her eye and she caught his, and they started talking and started going out dating, and obviously one thing led to another.
And roughly a year after Sandra and Mike met, they were married.
We didn't make his actual wedding. All of us came down afterwards to visit him and meet her, and he was happy. I mean, he moved off post with her, and they got an apartment at first.
That wasn't the only big change for Mike either. At only 21, he was suddenly stepfather to Sandy's 2 girls, both under the age of 6.
He loved the girls loved him.
He raised them. He gave them everything that they needed.
And so that he could spend more time with his new family, Mike left the military in 1987 when his 4-year enlistment was up and took a 9-to-5 job as a security guard.
He was always the breadwinner. Sandy had odd jobs at different convenience stores and places like that.
It wasn't enough for luxuries, but over the next 10 years, Sandra and Mike built a life together.
He had a good life down there. He had everything he wanted. He had a wife, he had kids, he had good friends, he had, the only thing he was missing was Colorado and his family.
Because while Mike and Sandra were in El Paso, his brothers had all settled around Colorado Springs, where their father had spent many years while stationed at Fort Carson.
Mike would bring him up to the holidays, Christmas, Thanksgiving, every year.
We'd go down at least once every couple of years to visit Mike and Sandy and the kids, just to go down to visit them, go over to Mexico, do some shopping, eating some food.
But Mike had always longed to be reunited with his brothers. And in 1996, after more than a decade in El Paso, his brother Greg gave him the chance to do just that.
I got him a job where we worked at the car dealership. I told him, if you want the job, they want you here Monday.
Mike, who was used to sudden moves, didn't hesitate for a minute.
Mike came up, and he left the girls down there so they can pack up and get the house ready for sale. And then we all went down and got the girls and Sandy, and we moved them all up there. And when they came up, Mike was thrilled. Sandy wasn't so thrilled because she moved away from her mom and her sisters. The girls, teenagers, they were mumbling and grumbling because they wanted to go back home, back to where they knew.
But after a few months, Sandra and the girls settled into life in Colorado Springs, which, thanks to the money Mike was making at his new job, was a step up from their old life in El Paso.
Mike was a very hard worker. He went to work every day like clockwork, came home every day like clockwork.
Everything seemed to be really good. They seemed to be happy, just like any typical American family.
Mike, happy to be reunited with his extended family, became very active in their church.
Mike was real involved. He was an usher, so he did Mass on Saturday night. Sunday mornings, they had breakfast after Mass down at the Knights of Columbus Hall. He would go down there and meet the guys, and, it was kind of his social hour. He would hang out, talk.
And while Sandra often went to Mass with her devout husband, she enjoyed more secular socializing.
Sandy would go up to Cripple Creek, which is a gambling community. You go up there, it's like a little miniature Las Vegas.
Their interests sometimes differed, but by 2013, after almost 30 years together, they still seemed devoted to one another.
They would spend the evenings out on the porch. They were good. They were a happy couple.
However, while Sandra's daughters were both grown by then, she and Mike weren't exactly empty nesters. 33-year-old Dawn, the oldest, was on the rebound, living at home after a series of failed relationships.
Dawn was in another state for a while, but they would come back and live for a while.
And Sandra's youngest daughter was living at home, too.
I don't think out of the 15 years we lived across the street that there was more than a year when they had the house to themselves.
Their mother and Mike were more than happy to help out, though.
He was very, very generous to the girls.
Everything was good. They seemed like they got along really well.
But the day before Valentine's Day, someone would break into the family's home and leave their happy life shattered. Coming up, evidence at the scene suggests a gang-related crime spree.
Colorado Springs was having a rash of home invasions and burglaries.
But investigators discovered there was some trouble at home.
Mike was saying that he was getting frustrated.
On the night of February 13, 2013, sheriff's deputies responding to a reported break-in found Sandra Barajas' husband, Mike, dead in their Colorado Springs, Colorado home.
He was shot more than one time with a handgun.
The shooting appeared to be the result of a burglary gone bad.
The window in the downstairs bathroom area appeared to have been broken from the outside in.
Those weren't the only things that suggested a robbery either.
Colorado Springs was having a rash of home invasions and burglaries.
And this time, the intruders may have left a calling card behind.
There was suspicious graffiti and markings within the residence.
The graffiti says something to the effect of, "You got jacked, fool," and WS13. 13 usually stands for a Hispanic gang.
Hoping for a little more information, the investigators turned to the person who'd placed the 911 call, Mike's stepdaughter, Dawn Richburg.
Dawn Richburg was the adult daughter of Sandra Barajas, who was living at the Barajas residence.
The 33-year-old told the investigator that she and her mother had taken her younger sister to the hospital earlier that day, and that she'd returned home just minutes before dialing 911.
Dawn was dropped off at the residence earlier in that evening by her mother. Once in there, she starts saying, "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy," calling for her father to let him know she was home. She gets no answer, starts getting a feeling, she tells me, that something's not right. He usually always answers when we call his name. So she looks down the hallway to her parents' bedroom, and everything looked in disarray. That's when she gets nervous, calls 911, and backs out of the house until the police arrive.
Dawn's story matched the account she'd given the 911 operator and the evidence at the scene, but there was something troubling about it.
Her demeanor to me was very flat, non-emotional.
It struck me as very odd how flat she was.
Was Mike's stepdaughter, whom he'd raised since the age of 6, simply in shock? For the moment, all the investigators knew for certain was that when Dawn's mother, 52-year-old Sandra Barajas, rushed to the scene after receiving notification of her husband's death, she completely broke down.
How do I get in my house? We don't know, honey. We can't do anything until we start processing everything, okay?
Oh my God. Mommy.
She was highly emotional, and as far as outward appearances, she appeared what you expect somebody who had lost a loved one.
I want to say mine.
Okay, listen. Listen.
I have to say mine. We just had our 47th anniversary. You just don't understand.
I understand.
Unfortunately, she had little to offer the investigators in the way of leads.
Do you have any enemies?
Nobody. Mike helped everybody.
But when Greg Barajas and his brother Chris rushed to the scene after receiving word of Mike's death, they did have something for the investigators. Chris told them he'd called Mike at around 6 o'clock that evening, barely an hour before Dawn dialed 911.
I called his house phone. He still had a house phone. And voice answered it.
A voice that wasn't Mike's.
I'm like, where's Mike at? And the guy that on the other end of the phone, he says, he must be in the shower. And I said, well, just tell him his brother Chris called.
Chris said he hadn't thought much of it at the time.
I didn't ask who he was because Don had guys hang around the house.
But the brothers said they'd become suspicious when they arrived at the scene and spotted a man they'd never seen before among the crowd of neighbors gawking from outside the police tape.
He just stuck out like a sore thumb, out there without a jacket.
It's February. It's probably low 30, 30 degrees. And he's got cargo shorts on and a t-shirt.
And then, moments before the brothers spoke to the investigators, the stranger had done something else that made them suspicious.
That guy walks up and asks, will you give me a ride? I go, give you a ride where? I said, who are you? And he goes, well, I'm the girl's friend.
Was he the same man Chris had spoken to on the phone? Neither of Mike's brothers knew for sure, but they thought the fact that the mystery man claimed to know Sandra's daughters could be significant.
Detective Otto, he started asking me, he goes, did he have any enemies? I said, the only enemies he has is his stepdaughter and her friends.
According to what his brothers told the investigator, the trouble between Mike and Dawn had started when she was in her teens.
She started having problems in school, and Dawn would get in trouble, and Mike would try to discipline her.
But it had little to no impact. After Dawn barely graduated, she left home and spent the next decade drifting from place to place and from one bad decision to the next.
She was always chasing after men, and she started doing drugs.
But a few months before her stepfather's murder, Dawn had ended up back home.
She was living with the guy up on the north side of Springs, and he died of a drug overdose.
The brothers said that Mike had been willing to take his stepdaughter in at first, but as the weeks and then months went by and she showed no intention of moving out, the old tensions resurfaced.
Mike was saying that he was getting frustrated, so I think it was starting to cause a lot of issues between the two of them.
And now, since a strange man who claimed to be Dawn's friend had been hanging around the crime scene, the investigators couldn't help but wonder, did the friction between Mike and his stepdaughter have something to do with his death?
I felt that something wasn't right here.
So that night, the investigators asked Dawn to come down to the sheriff's office for a formal statement, without indicating that they considered her a person of interest.
Dawn, I am sorry for your loss tonight. I know it's tough.
Dawn replied by claiming to have a good relationship with her stepfather.
We have good. We don't talk every single day, or I don't hug him every single day, but we joke around a lot.
It was precisely the opening the investigators had been waiting for.
It'll be a little bit different story.
Put on the spot, Dawn insisted that her relationship with Mike had been good.
He even told me he'd help me buy me a car. So, I didn't see no problems between us.
However, she did admit to having problems with drugs.
Have you ever been arrested before?
Yes.
Okay, for what?
Heroin.
But she insisted that she didn't know anything about her stepfather's murder.
I don't have nothing to hide. I didn't do nothing.
The investigators weren't sure they believed that.
Her demeanor led the detectives to the belief that there was more information that she knew.
But they had to let her go.
But it wasn't enough to be able to charge anybody.
However, they did give her a stern warning.
I really hope you think that
if you were involved in this, that you would be wise enough to tell me your story before somebody else did. Because I can tell you this, these cases, we will solve it. It's just a matter of time.
Coming up, the investigators track down the mystery man from the crime scene.
He was a top suspect in a series of unsolved break-ins.
But his arrest leads to a surprising twist.
Let me talk to your mom.
By Valentine's Day 2013, it had been less than 24 hours since Sandra Barajas' husband Mike was found murdered in the couple's Colorado Springs home.
There was a great level of fear because our neighborhood is a very quiet neighborhood. We have a lot of retirees. We've never really had any issues in our neighborhood. And then for that to happen, it's just quite a shock.
We just didn't know how that had happened or who had done it or anything. And it was a stark reality that it can happen anywhere.
But while the family's neighbors remained in the dark, the investigators were beginning to suspect that Sandra's daughter, 33-year-old Dawn Richburg, knew more about the crime than she was telling the police.
We've determined that Dawn had a substance abuse problem.
Right away, I suspected the daughter's friends robbed the house, and maybe it was a robbery gone bad. Mike walked in on them.
And then there was the mystery man Mike's brothers had spotted hanging around the house after the shooting. Was he the killer? The police couldn't rule out the possibility.
Investigators take intense interest in who this man might be.
And since the mystery man had been asking for a ride, the investigators took a long shot.
We contacted the local taxi cab company and tried to determine if there had been any pickups in the area on the night of the homicide.
The result was an incredible break.
There had been a request for a taxi cab to pick an individual up at a location that was basically just outside the police cordon around the residence.
And if that wasn't lucky enough, when the investigators tracked down the cell phone used to call the cab, they came up with a name: 34-year-old Tommy Wright.
Tommy was definitely an individual that was someone the police wanted to talk to.
And while investigators set out to find him, they brought in Sandra to see if Tommy had any connection to her husband.
Have you ever heard the name Tommy?
I heard the name.
Mentioned by your daughters?
I heard the name, but I don't know who he is.
Though Sandra said she thought Tommy had been to the Barajas house.
He's only come over to the house once, and that was in December.
Yeah, I mean, unless he's been there, when we weren't there, but I only remember him coming over like one time.
The info made Tommy the top suspect in Mike's murder, but it took almost a week until February 20th for the investigators to track down Tommy Wright.
We were contacted by the Springfield Police Department in the very southeast corner of the state of Colorado.
They'd just picked up Tommy for an unrelated crime.
Tommy Wright was arrested on car theft charges, aggravated motor vehicle theft charges.
As soon as they got word that he was in custody, the Colorado Springs detectives made the 3-hour drive to Springfield. But they didn't find Tommy in a cooperative mood.
He didn't want to talk to us when he was arrested in Springfield.
Would they even need him to talk, though? After their trip to Springfield, the investigators returned to Colorado Springs and got a warrant to search Tommy's car and the apartment where he'd been staying.
Sergeant Otto, during his search of the vehicle and the apartment, recovered a .45 caliber handgun.
The gun was sent to the crime lab to determine if it was the murder weapon.
They compare the bullets that were recovered from Mike's body to the firearm.
But if the bullets matched, would it be case closed? Or would a shocking new development take the investigation in a surprising direction? By May 17, 2013, it had been 3 months since her husband's murder, and Sandra Barajas and her daughters were struggling to move on without Mike.
She said that they were hoping to move to another state where there was some family and some support, and that they were just hoping to start over.
And it seemed that Sandra might soon have some official closure, too, once the ballistics came back on the gun found in Tommy Wright's car.
We did have the murder weapon.
And on May 17th, during the grand jury hearing to formally indict Tommy Wright for Mike's murder, the authorities received an unexpected break.
Sitting next to DA Reggie Short, getting a text message from one of my cohorts saying that Tommy Wright is willing to tell everything.
Hoping for a confession, the prosecutors arranged to put the grand jury hearing on hold while the investigators once again sat down with Tommy.
He completely acknowledged that he had been the one who fired the fatal shot.
He took 2 steps forward to the bed. That's when I stood up and shot him.
But just when the investigators figured they had everything they needed to convict Tommy of murder, his confession took an unexpected turn.
Tommy reveals that this wasn't a break-in after all. It was a murder plot.
And the real shock was who Tommy claimed was behind it.
He had done it in concert with, or specifically at the request, of Sandra Barajas.
Tommy's claim caught the investigators completely by surprise.
Quite frankly, Sandra Barajas was not a person of interest, and over the course of several opportunities to speak with her, she certainly appeared to be distraught over the loss of her husband.
But according to Tommy, it was all an act. Tommy told the investigators that he'd met Sandra through her daughters.
Tommy told me that he met Dawn and her sister at a local convenience store in Colorado Springs. They met, started talking, some flirting. He goes with Dawn, her sister, to the residence. He spends some time there. They party, do drugs, things like that.
And according to Tommy, once Dawn brought him home, Sandy had approached him with an offer.
Sandy tells Tommy Wright she wants her husband dead.
They're supposed to give me the truck. They offered me $5,000 in cash.
However, according to Tommy, it wasn't just the $5,000 Sandy offered that sealed the deal. It was something else.
Sandra had told Tommy that Mike had been behaving inappropriately with Dawn's sister in a sexual manner.
This infuriated Tommy, and he felt he was going to step up and do the right thing if he would kill Mike Barajas.
Tommy told me that they talked about the plan to kill Mike, and they agreed. They came up with a plan, down to details.
They're going to stage a burglary. They're going to use spray paint to write messages on the wall and suggest that it's gang members who broke into the house.
Tommy said that once the plans were set, Sandra and Dawn took Dawn's sister to the hospital so that Sandra would have an alibi.
They left the residence, leaving Tommy right behind.
I started painting right as they were leaving.
And then, after taking the .45 from Mike's gun cabinet, Tommy had laid an ambush.
He describes positioning himself inside the bedroom with the lights turned off.
And at around 6 o'clock, Mike came into the house.
He described the moment that Mike walked into his bedroom. Tommy said he was crouched at Mike's bed, holding a .45 caliber pistol.
After Mikkel is dead, what all do you do? I just look at the showcase.
But then, while waiting for Sandra to pick him up when she dropped off Dawn to find her stepfather's body, the plan had gone awry.
The phone rang, and he answered the phone thinking it was them, and it was actually Chris.
That phone call screwed my whole day up.
Because according to Tommy, after he'd hung up on Mike's brother, he panicked and fled the house.
He hides in a drainage ditch, and at some point, he doubles back and returns to the house. He asks several people for a ride, and when he can't get one, he uses a cell phone to call a cab company.
The things that Tommy was telling me fit and were consistent with what we had found.
But would it be enough to pin the murder on Sandra and her daughter?
I proposed to Tommy that he place a phone call to Sandra to talk about what happened with Mike.
Minutes later, with the detectives listening in, Tommy made the call, but it was Sandra's daughter who answered.
Hey, Don.
Yeah.
What's up? It's Tommy.
Oh, what's up?
It's clear from the first words of that phone call that Dawn is A, not thrilled to hear from Tommy, and B, very concerned that this person would be reaching out to her.
But Tommy pushed on, regardless.
Let me talk to your mom, because she kind of owes me big time. You guys all owe me big time.
Dawn didn't deny it, and when she put her mother on the phone, Tommy quickly got her to admit even more.
I told you I'd take his ass out, and I did I not? And if I'm saying that would be stupid of me to say if somebody listened.
I do have to give Tommy credit. He was very savvy on the phone.
I kept my word, and I killed Mike for you, did I not?
Yeah.
Okay, so here's what I need from you.
He needs his money.
Money that, as it turned out, Sandra didn't have.
How much money will you be able to give me?
I give you $500.
It was only a tenth of what he'd been promised, but the fact that Sandra agreed to pay Tommy anything was enough for the investigators.
Sandra agrees to meet Tommy at the Walmart location on the north end of town, where we have, obviously, units waiting for her.
As soon as she got into the area, she was stopped, contacted, and subsequently arrested.
And soon after Sandra's arrest, deputies went to her house and took her daughter Dawn into custody too.
When we heard about the arrest, we were surprised, but in some ways it was a relief to know that it wasn't some random attack.
Coming up, the trial reveals a possible motive.
You go up there and you can lose all your money in hours.
But is the prosecution's star witness worth the gamble?
We felt we had to make a deal with the devil.
On February 4th, 2014, Sandra Barajas went on trial for murder in the El Paso County Courthouse in Colorado Springs. The 53-year-old was accused of orchestrating the murder of her husband, Mike, who died in February of 2013, the victim of what initially appeared to be a home invasion robbery.
There was quite a bit of evidence that supported that idea.
But when the investigators caught up with Mike's killer, a petty thief named Tommy Wright, he told them that the so-called home invasion was just a cover for a murder plot cooked up by Sandra and her daughter, 34-year-old Dawn Richburg.
Tommy, Dawn, and Sandra were all arrested for Mike's murder.
But why would Sandra and her daughter want Mike dead? It certainly wasn't the reason they gave Tommy when they recruited him as Mike's killer.
We never found one piece of evidence, one statement that substantiated the claim that Mike had sexually abused Dawn's sister.
Instead, in his opening statement, the prosecutor claimed that Sandra's motive was far simpler.
She had a gambling problem.
According to the prosecutors and Mike's brothers, Sandra's gambling trips to Cripple Creek had crippled the family's finances.
You go up there and you can lose all your money in hours.
That was a family in severe financial distress, and it appeared to be a condition that was getting worse at every opportunity. The family was having difficulty making their bills.
He was starting to have problems with making the mortgage payment every month. But he was telling us my house is in foreclosure.
And the prosecutors theorized that by the beginning of 2013, things had gotten so bad that Mike finally decided to do something about it.
I believe he finally told her that he wanted a divorce.
And since Sandra didn't have a full-time job, the prosecution argued that Mike's decision had created a new crisis for Sandra and Dawn.
Sandy doesn't work. You could count on one hand how many times she's ever had a job in the whole time they were married. They couldn't survive without Mike.
At least not if he divorced Sandra. But if Mike died?
They knew Mike had life insurance.
It wasn't really a whole lot. I think all said and done, it was $150,000.
But according to the prosecution, that $150,000 was more than enough.
Anytime that you've got family and financial distress, that's always a motivation.
Sandra wanted to pay off the bills, to pay off the house, to pay off whatever bill she had, and then have money extra.
And that wasn't the only way that Sandra could cash in on her husband's death either.
They had an accidental death that they had through his work and then his retirement.
He was worth more to them dead than he was alive.
And they figured they could live the rest of their life off of what they got off of him.
According to the prosecution, it was easy to convince Sandra's drug-addicted daughter to go along with the plan.
This was a murder plot that was hashed out while Don and Tommy Wright were using methamphetamine.
And they claimed that Sandra's offer of $5,000 just as easily convinced Tommy to be the trigger man.
Paying someone to kill someone that you married and was the love of your life at one time is just unimaginable.
It might have seemed unimaginable to most people, but the prosecutors had a powerful witness prepared to testify that it was true.
The district attorney's office had come to an agreement with Tommy Wright.
It was either nail him to the wall, because they definitely have the evidence, and send him to prison for life and let Sandy possibly walk, or make a deal with him and get Sandy.
We felt we had to make a deal with the devil.
And when he took the stand, Tommy did his best to look the part.
Tommy was entirely nonchalant about the description of killing somebody.
He had like a smirk on his face, like he enjoyed it.
And as he testified, the entire courtroom hung on his every word.
It was absolutely riveting to hear.
Or infuriating, depending on one's perspective.
I wanted to get up there and go beat him to a pulp is what I wanted to do.
Tommy had such an arrogance about himself.
In fact, Tommy's arrogance was so off-putting that the prosecutors worried that his testimony could backfire.
We were concerned it wouldn't be enough to get a first-degree murder conviction.
Luckily, they had the tapes to back up Tommy's story.
But I kept my word and I killed Mike for you, did I not?
We felt it was beyond a reasonable doubt that she should be convicted of first-degree murder.
However, despite the phone calls and the fact that she'd been arrested while trying to pay her husband's killer, the defense argued that Sandra was innocent.
She has steadfastly maintained that she was not responsible for Tommy Wright killing her husband.
She was somewhat in disbelief, almost like we were making these things up.
However, there were at least some parts of Tommy's testimony that the defense agreed with.
The suggestion from Sandra Barajas is that it was Tommy Wright and Dawn Richburg who were responsible for the murder.
And according to the defense, Sandra wasn't involved at all. It was her daughter, Dawn, who'd recruited Tommy alone.
Sandy and her defense team basically turned the whole thing over against Dawn.
She had a problem with drugs, would do anything to get them, saw her stepfather, Mike, as someone who was in the way of her getting what she wanted.
And according to the defense, she didn't hesitate to get rid of her stepfather, the man that had raised her from the time she was 6 years old.
They describe her as a con artist, backstabber, very mean, hateful person. She would do anything to get to what she needs.
She was very manipulative. She was a liar. My belief is she is a cold-blooded person too, and very, very capable of murder.
But if that were true, why was Sandra the one who'd been arrested paying for the hit? According to the defense, it was only because Dawn had pressured her mother into it.
They said Dawn was so manipulative, Dawn was so demanding, Dawn so mean, I'm terrified for my life. It's all we heard for a week and a half was Dawn, Dawn, Dawn.
Coming up, will the jurors believe a confessed killer?
Tommy would not be credible.
Or will they side with Sandra?
The longer it goes, typically it doesn't go in the prosecution's favor.
On Friday, February 21st, 2014, the jury announced a verdict in the murder trial of Sandra Barajas. The 53-year-old mother of two was charged with orchestrating the murder of her husband, Mike.
She's the one who, lack of a better word, was the brains of the operation. She was in it up to her eyeballs.
This was Sandra actively participating, actively seeking out someone to carry this out.
And the man who'd carried it out, 35-year-old Tommy Wright, had been the star witness for the prosecution.
Tommy testified, and it was tough. I mean, because you had to sit there, listen to all the gruesome details.
But would those gruesome details be enough for a conviction? Or would his conduct on the witness stand sway the jury in Sandra's favor?
He, at various points, seemed to break out into either a smirk or some sort of laughter.
She thought that she would get off, that she would be found not guilty, that Tommy would not be credible.
And when the jury finally filed back into the courtroom, Sandra may have had reason to feel confident.
The deliberation went 2.5 days, which started to worry me because I've always heard the longer the jury deliberates, typically it doesn't go in the prosecution's favor.
But would that be true this time?
Sandra was found guilty of first-degree murder.
She was very, very surprised when she was convicted. That shocked her.
Mike's brothers were just as overcome.
They were all very happy, broke down, started crying.
She was going to jail for life.
In Colorado, the sentence for first-degree murder is life without parole.
Sandra's conviction was enough to convince her daughter, Dawn Richburg, to cut a deal. The 34-year-old had also been charged with her stepfather's murder.
Dawn pled to second-degree murder.
She had just seen her mother be sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. I think that anybody would have to think twice about whether they wanted to go through that same process with that same potential outcome.
Since the trial, Mike's younger brothers still struggle to deal with their loss.
I lay awake at night thinking my brother died senselessly.
He was a good father, husband, just all the way around a good man.
But they take comfort in knowing that Sandra will ultimately pay the price for what she's done.
It's a peaceful thought to think she's going to take her last breath behind those walls.
Utah 1989 cold case solved. One overlooked detail exposes suspect. The winter wind had been screaming through the empty streets of a small Utah town for 3 decades, carrying with it a question that refused to disappear. What happened on that cold night in 1989? For years, the answer remained buried beneath forgotten evidence boxes, fading memories, and a case file that investigators once feared would never be opened again. A young woman vanished without warning. A community was left searching for answers. And somewhere in the shadows, a secret was kept alive for decades. But hidden inside the original investigation was one overlooked detail. A detail that had been sitting there all along. A detail nobody noticed. Until now. It was January 14th, 1989, when the quiet mountain community of Cedar Ridge, Utah, woke up to a nightmare that would change the town forever. The snow had covered the roads overnight, turning familiar streets into frozen pathways of silence. The kind of morning where every sound seemed distant. Every movement seemed slow. 23-year-old Emily Carter was supposed to arrive home before midnight. She never did. Emily was known throughout the town as someone who brought warmth wherever she went. She worked at a small local bookstore near the downtown district and was preparing to begin a new chapter in her life. Friends described her as ambitious, independent, and full of plans. She had recently enrolled in evening classes, hoping to eventually become a teacher. She spent weekends hiking through Utah's rugged landscapes, photographing abandoned buildings and forgotten places. She was the kind of person who noticed details others ignored. A person who remembered everything. But on that freezing night, Emily disappeared. The last confirmed sighting came shortly after 10:30 p.m. A customer at the bookstore remembered seeing her lock the front door after closing. A neighbor across the street recalled watching Emily walk toward her car, carrying a small bag and a stack of books. Then she was gone. Her vehicle was found the next morning less than 2 miles away from her apartment. The driver's side door was unlocked. The keys were missing. And inside the car was something investigators would later call the first sign that this was not a simple disappearance. Emily's personal notebook was sitting on the passenger seat. Open. The final page contained a handwritten sentence. Only 6 words. "Someone knows what I found." Those words immediately changed the direction of the investigation. At first, police believed Emily may have left voluntarily. Young adults disappeared before. Sometimes they started over somewhere else. Sometimes they avoided family and friends for personal reasons. But Emily's life did not match that theory. Her bank account was untouched. Her apartment remained exactly as she left it. Her clothes, photographs, and personal belongings were still there. Her family insisted something had happened. And they were right. Within hours, the Cedar Ridge Police Department launched one of the largest searches the county had ever seen. Volunteers walked through snowy fields. Officers searched abandoned structures. Helicopters flew above the surrounding mountains. Every road, every trail, every possible location. But Emily was nowhere. The investigation quickly became a race against time. Detectives began interviewing everyone connected to her life. Friends, co-workers, neighbors, former classmates. The questions were always the same. Who would want to hurt Emily Carter? And why? The first major lead came from a strange phone call. 3 days after Emily disappeared, the police station received an anonymous message. The caller claimed they had seen Emily arguing with someone outside the bookstore on the night she vanished. The caller refused to give a name. They refused to meet investigators. And before police could trace the call, the line went dead. The information was enough to reopen the timeline. Detectives discovered that a man had been parked near the bookstore shortly before closing time. Several witnesses remembered seeing a dark-colored pickup truck idling nearby, but nobody could identify the driver. The vehicle became the first major mystery in the case. Who was inside? And why was he watching Emily? Investigators spent weeks searching for answers. They collected fingerprints. They examined phone records. They followed hundreds of tips. But every path led to another dead end. The case slowly began to consume the town. Cedar Ridge was not a large city. People knew each other. They recognized familiar faces. They trusted their neighbors. That trust began to disappear. Parents stopped allowing their children to walk home alone. Residents checked their doors twice before going to sleep. The disappearance of Emily Carter became a permanent scar on the community. And as months turned into years, the case became colder. The evidence became older. The memories became weaker. By the early 1990s, investigators had reviewed thousands of pages of documents. They had interviewed dozens of people. They had searched locations that seemed impossible to ignore. Yet Emily remained missing. No suspect. No confession. No answers. The case officially became one of Utah's most haunting cold cases. But investigators never completely closed the file, because there was always something that bothered them. Something about the evidence. Something about the night Emily vanished. Detective Michael Reeves, one of the original investigators assigned to the case, continued reviewing the files long after the active investigation slowed down. Years later, he admitted there was one detail he could never forget. A small piece of evidence collected from Emily's car. A piece that seemed meaningless at the time. A small trace left behind. A mistake. A forgotten clue. In 1989, forensic technology was nowhere near what it would become decades later. DNA analysis was still developing. Many departments did not have the resources or equipment to fully examine biological evidence. Some evidence was stored. Some evidence was overlooked. And some evidence waited. Hidden. Silent. Patient. For nearly 30 years, the case remained frozen in time. Until advancements in forensic science brought new attention to old investigations. Cold cases across the country were being reopened. Forgotten evidence was being tested again. Crimes once considered impossible to solve were suddenly producing answers. And in 2018, the Utah Cold Case Unit decided to take another look at Emily Carter's disappearance. The original investigators were gone or retired. The witnesses were older. Some had passed away, but the evidence remained. The new team started from the beginning. They rebuilt the timeline. They reviewed every interview. They studied every photograph. They searched through every piece of evidence collected in 1989. And then they found something hidden inside the original case file. A detail that had been overlooked for decades. A tiny piece of evidence that investigators in 1989 never realized could reveal the truth. It was not a dramatic discovery. It was not a hidden confession. It was not a secret document. It was something much smaller. Something almost invisible. A trace left behind by someone who believed they had gotten away forever. The forensic team carefully removed the old evidence from storage. The packaging was worn. The labels were faded. The memories attached to it had almost disappeared. But science had changed, and the smallest details could now speak. The investigators knew they might only get one chance, because after 30 years, the truth had been buried beneath decades of silence. But when the test results finally returned, the case that had haunted Utah for generations began moving again. And the person who had been hiding in plain sight for all those years was about to learn one terrifying fact. Time does not always erase evidence. Sometimes, it preserves it. The evidence that had waited for nearly 30 years inside a forgotten storage room was finally speaking. For decades, the case of Emily Carter had been nothing more than a painful memory. A name printed on missing person posters. A photograph that remained pinned to bulletin boards long after the paper had turned yellow. A question repeated by her family every year. Where did she go? Who took her?
And why?
But now, for the first time in years, investigators believed they were no longer chasing a ghost. They were chasing a person. The breakthrough began with a small item recovered from Emily's vehicle on that freezing morning in 1989. At the time, investigators had considered it insignificant. A simple piece of fabric. A tiny fragment found near the passenger seat. Something that appeared to have no connection to the disappearance. In 1989, it was placed into evidence. Then forgotten. The original detectives had examined the vehicle carefully. They searched for fingerprints. They collected possible traces. They photographed everything inside the car. But the technology of that era had limits. A microscopic sample that could reveal a person's identity decades later was almost impossible to imagine. Back then, investigators needed obvious clues. A weapon. A witness. A confession. They did not know that the smallest piece of evidence would eventually become the loudest voice in the investigation. When the cold case team reopened the file, they noticed something unusual. The fabric fragment had never been fully analyzed. It had been tested for basic evidence, but no DNA profile had ever been created. That changed everything. The investigators carefully sent the sample to a modern forensic laboratory. The process was slow. Every step had to be handled with extreme caution. After 30 years, contamination was a major concern. The team knew the possibility existed that the sample would reveal nothing. A dead end. Another disappointment. But then the results came back. And the entire investigation changed direction. The laboratory discovered a partial DNA profile. Not enough at first to immediately identify someone, but enough to begin searching. Enough to reopen questions that had been buried for decades. The detectives returned to the original timeline. They looked again at everyone connected to Emily's life. And one name began appearing more frequently. A person who had been interviewed in 1989. A person who had never been considered a serious suspect. A person who had remained just close enough to the investigation to know what police knew, but far enough away to avoid attention. His name was Daniel Mercer. In 1989, Mercer was 31 years old. He worked as a mechanic at a repair shop outside Cedar Ridge. At the time of Emily's disappearance, he told investigators he barely knew her. He claimed he had only spoken with her a few times when she brought her car in for minor repairs. Nothing unusual. Nothing suspicious. Detectives originally accepted his explanation. There was no physical evidence connecting him to the disappearance. No witness placed him with Emily. No clear motive. No reason to focus on him. But the reopened investigation revealed something that had been missed.
Daniel Mercer hat lied.
Not about everything. Only one detail. But it was enough. Investigators discovered that Mercer had known far more about Emily's life than he admitted. He knew where she worked. He knew her schedule. He knew she often stayed late at the bookstore. And according to old records, he had contacted her several times during the weeks before she vanished. Those calls had never been considered suspicious in 1989. At the time, phone records were incomplete. Tracking communication patterns was much more difficult. But decades later, digital databases allowed investigators to reconstruct the past. The picture became clearer. Emily had not been randomly targeted. Someone had been watching her. Someone had been learning her routine. And someone had been waiting. The cold case team interviewed Mercer again. At first, he appeared calm, confident. He was older now. Gray hair. Slower movements. A man who had spent decades believing the past was behind him. When detectives mentioned the DNA evidence, his expression changed. Only for a moment. But they noticed. The investigators asked him simple questions. Where was he on the night Emily disappeared? Did he remember seeing her? Did he know anything about the truck witnesses reported near the bookstore? Mercer repeated his old story. He said he had nothing to do with Emily's disappearance. He said he had already answered these questions 30 years earlier. But investigators were no longer relying only on his words. They were looking at the evidence. And the evidence was leading them somewhere unexpected. The dark pickup truck. The anonymous phone call. The strange notebook entry. The missing keys. The fabric fragment. Suddenly, the old clues were no longer separate pieces. They were connected. The investigation revealed that Mercer owned a dark-colored pickup truck in 1989. The same type of vehicle witnesses described outside the bookstore. At the time, police had known about the truck. But dozens of similar vehicles existed in the area. It was never enough to make an arrest. Now, combined with the DNA evidence, it became another piece of the puzzle. But there was still one problem. The DNA match was incomplete. Investigators needed more. They needed a confirmed sample directly connected to Mercer. So they began surveillance. They watched him. They followed his movements. They waited. Not because they wanted to prove a theory. Because they needed the truth. And after weeks of observation, they got their chance. A discarded coffee cup. A small object thrown away without a second thought. To most people, it was garbage. To investigators, it was evidence. The forensic team recovered the item and compared the DNA. The results were overwhelming. The profile matched. The man who had once been considered only a witness was now the center of the investigation. After 30 years, detectives finally had what they needed. But the discovery created another question. If Daniel Mercer was responsible, what happened to Emily Carter? Because finding the person connected to the evidence was only the beginning. The most important mystery remained unsolved. Where was Emily? The investigators returned to Cedar Ridge. They searched locations connected to Mercer. Old properties. Former workplaces. Areas he had access to in 1989. They looked beneath the surface of places that had never been considered important. And slowly, another disturbing pattern emerged. Mercer had moved several times after Emily disappeared. He changed jobs. He left the area. He started a new life hundreds of miles away. A life built on the belief that nobody would ever uncover what happened. But the cold case investigation was breaking apart that illusion. Every year, he had spent hiding. Every birthday. Every holiday. Every normal day. The evidence had been waiting. The investigators began preparing for the moment they would confront him. But before they could make an arrest, they needed one final piece. A confession. Or the discovery of what happened to Emily Carter. Because after 30 years of silence, the family deserved more than a suspect. They deserved answers. And deep beneath the Utah landscape, investigators believed those answers were still waiting. The forgotten detail had exposed the suspect. Now they had to uncover the truth that had been buried with it. For 30 years, Daniel Mercer had lived with a secret hidden behind ordinary routines, behind morning coffees, behind conversations with neighbors, behind the appearance of a man who had moved on from the past. But the past had not moved on from him. The investigators now had a name. They had DNA. They had a connection to the night Emily Carter vanished. But one question continued to haunt the entire investigation. Where was Emily? The answer was buried somewhere. The problem was finding where. When detectives reopened the case, they did not begin by looking for new evidence. They began by looking at old evidence differently. The original investigation had focused heavily on Emily's final known moments. The bookstore, the parking lot, the vehicle, the mysterious truck. But the new team realized something important. The person responsible did not appear out of nowhere. Someone had entered Emily's life before that night. Someone had created an opportunity. Someone had gained her trust. And that person was likely closer than anyone imagined. Investigators began rebuilding Emily's final weeks. They examined every conversation, every appointment, every interaction. They discovered that Emily had become increasingly uncomfortable shortly before disappearing. A detail that had been mentioned briefly by friends in 1989 suddenly became important. Emily had told someone she felt like she was being watched. At the time, her friends believed she was simply stressed. She had been studying, working late, planning her future. Everyone assumed the pressure of adulthood was catching up with her. But years later, those words carried a different meaning. Someone was watching her, and Emily knew it. One of her closest friends, Sarah Mitchell, was interviewed again. She was older now. The pain of losing Emily had never disappeared. She still remembered the final conversation they had, a conversation that had seemed ordinary at the time. Emily had called her the evening before she vanished. She sounded distracted, quiet, not afraid, but different. Sarah told investigators that Emily mentioned a strange encounter with someone connected to her car repairs. A man who asked too many questions. A man who seemed too interested in where she was going. At the time, Sarah never imagined that conversation would matter decades later. But now investigators were listening carefully, because that description matched Daniel Mercer, the man who claimed he barely knew Emily, the man whose DNA had been found. The man who had spent 30 years denying any involvement. Detectives searched deeper into Mercer's history. They discovered that after Emily disappeared, he left Cedar Ridge within months. He claimed it was for work, a normal career decision. But investigators found something unusual. He had never mentioned leaving during the original interviews. He had not told police he was planning to move. He simply disappeared from the area after the investigation began slowing down. A coincidence? Maybe. But in a cold case, every coincidence becomes a question. And every question can become a clue. The investigation moved toward Mercer's former properties. One location stood out. A small piece of land outside town where Mercer had once stored equipment. The property had changed owners multiple times. The buildings had been removed. The landscape had been altered. But investigators believed something important may have happened there. Search teams arrived with modern equipment, ground-penetrating technology, forensic specialists, experts trained to find what decades had hidden. The community watched as the search unfolded. For older residents of Cedar Ridge, it felt impossible. A case they believed would never move again was suddenly alive. News crews returned. Cameras surrounded the courthouse. The phrase that had disappeared for years returned to headlines. Cold case reopened. New DNA evidence. Decades-old mystery approaching breakthrough. The town that had once lived with uncertainty was now waiting for answers. But the search produced nothing. Days passed. Then weeks. No discovery. No remains.
No final explanation.
The investigators refused to give up. They knew the absence of evidence did not mean the absence of the truth. Because they had seen this before. Cold cases were not solved by one dramatic moment. They were solved by patience, by connecting forgotten details, by asking questions nobody thought to ask. And then came another breakthrough. A retired officer contacted the cold case unit. His name was Robert Hayes. He had been one of the first officers at Emily's abandoned vehicle in 1989. For decades, he had carried something that bothered him, something he never forgot. He told investigators that when he arrived at the scene, he noticed something unusual. The car did not look abandoned. It looked interrupted, as if someone had left in a hurry. The driver's seat position, the open door, the items inside. Everything suggested that Emily had not planned to leave. She had been forced to leave. But there was another detail, a detail he never considered important.
Until now.
Officer Hayes remembered seeing mud near the passenger side floor. Small marks, almost invisible. At the time, investigators focused on the obvious evidence. They photographed the vehicle. They collected fingerprints. They searched for signs of violence. The mud was ignored. But decades later, investigators reviewed the original photographs, and they noticed something: the pattern. The marks were not random. They matched a specific type of work boot, a style commonly worn by mechanics, a style Daniel Mercer was known to wear. Suddenly, another forgotten detail connected to the DNA evidence: the fabric, the truck, the phone call, the boot prints, the lies. Everything pointed in the same direction. But investigators still needed to know what happened after Emily left her car. The answer came from an unexpected source. A former employee at Mercer's old workplace. A man who had stayed silent for years. He contacted police after seeing news reports about the DNA match. He said there was something he needed to tell them. Something he should have said decades earlier. In 1989, shortly after Emily disappeared, Mercer had shown up at the repair shop late at night. He was nervous, angry, different. The employee remembered seeing scratches on Mercer's truck. Fresh scratches. When asked about them, Mercer gave a strange explanation. He said he hit a fence. Nobody questioned it. Not then. But 30 years later, that memory became another piece of the puzzle. Investigators now believed they were close. Very close. But the final truth remained hidden. Because Daniel Mercer still refused to admit anything. And without Emily's location, the family was still trapped between hope and heartbreak. The suspect had been exposed. The evidence had finally broken the silence. But the last chapter of Emily Carter's story had not yet been found. And somewhere beyond the roads of Cedar Ridge, beyond the mountains and the empty fields, the final secret of that winter night was still waiting to be uncovered. The investigation had reached a moment nobody in Cedar Ridge thought they would ever see. After 30 years of silence, the name Daniel Mercer was no longer just a forgotten memory from an old case file. It was a name connected to evidence. A name connected to DNA. A name connected to a disappearance that had haunted an entire community. But for Emily Carter's family, the discovery brought a painful truth. Finding the person responsible did not bring Emily back. It did not answer every question. It did not erase the years of waiting. Because one mystery remained. Where was Emily? The investigators knew Daniel Mercer held the key. The challenge was making him reveal it. When detectives brought Mercer in for questioning, they did not expect a dramatic confession. They knew people who carried secrets for decades rarely broke easily. They had spent years building walls around their lies. And Mercer was no different. He sat across from investigators inside a quiet interview room. A man in his 60s. Older. Calmer. Someone who looked nothing like the person witnesses remembered from 1989. The detectives placed photographs on the table. Emily's missing poster. The bookstore. The abandoned car. The evidence. They watched his reaction. At first, nothing changed. He denied knowing anything. He repeated the same statement he had given decades earlier. He said he had nothing to do with Emily's disappearance. He said the DNA evidence was impossible. He said the investigators were making a mistake. But then the detectives mentioned something they had never revealed publicly. The exact location where the DNA had been recovered. The exact item. The exact evidence. And for the first time, Mercer stopped talking. A few seconds of silence filled the room. A silence that investigators noticed immediately. Because sometimes the smallest reaction tells the biggest story. The interview continued for hours. Mercer changed details. Small changes. Minor differences. But enough. Investigators compared his new statements with his original interview from 1989. The contradictions were obvious. 30 years earlier, Mercer claimed he never had any personal interaction with Emily. Now he admitted they had spoken several times. 30 years earlier, he claimed he never visited the bookstore. Now he admitted he had been there. 30 years earlier, he claimed he barely remembered the night she disappeared. Now he remembered specific details. The more he explained, the more questions appeared. But Mercer still refused to answer the most important one. What happened to Emily Carter? The investigators continued searching. They examined every location connected to Mercer. They reviewed property records. They studied old maps. They looked at places that had changed over time. Because they understood something important. A person can hide evidence, but they cannot erase history. Every place has a memory. Every road, every building, every piece of land. And somewhere they believed the truth was waiting. The breakthrough came from an old photograph. A photograph that had been sitting in the original investigation file for decades. It showed Mercer's truck parked near his workplace shortly after Emily disappeared. At first glance, it seemed meaningless. Just another image from a crime scene. But modern forensic analysis revealed something investigators in 1989 could not see. The truck's rear area contained signs of recent modification. A repaired section. A replaced panel. A small change that had never been documented. Investigators compared the vehicle records. They discovered Mercer had taken the truck to a repair shop only days after Emily vanished. His explanation at the time was simple. A minor accident. But the timing was disturbing. The investigators now believed the truck was not just a witness to the crime. It was part of the crime. The evidence became stronger. The case became darker. But the search for Emily continued. Then came the discovery that changed everything. A former landowner contacted investigators after seeing reports about the case. He owned a property that had once belonged to Daniel Mercer. A property outside Cedar Ridge. Remote. Quiet. The kind of place where someone could hide something for years. The man told detectives something unusual. During construction work in the early 1990s, he had discovered an area of disturbed ground near an old storage building. At the time, he assumed it was nothing. Old land. Old repairs. Nothing worth reporting. But now, 30 years later, he wondered. Could it have been connected? The investigators moved quickly. The property was searched again. This time with advanced forensic equipment. The area was carefully examined. Every inch documented. The search continued for days. Then, beneath layers of earth that had remained untouched for decades, something was found. A small object. Weathered. Damaged. But recognizable. Investigators immediately knew the discovery could change everything. The evidence was sent for analysis. The entire case seemed to freeze. The community waited. Emily's family waited. Everyone wanted answers. But investigators refused to announce anything before they were certain. Because after 30 years, they had learned one lesson. Hope could be dangerous. A mistake could destroy everything. The forensic results finally arrived. And the discovery confirmed what many had feared. The object belonged to Emily Carter. The missing woman whose disappearance had become one of Utah's most haunting cold cases. The news spread quickly. The mystery that had lasted 3 decades was finally beginning to unravel. But there was still one final piece missing. The exact sequence of events. What happened that night? How did Emily end up there? And why did Daniel Mercer choose to keep silent for 30 years? Investigators returned to the timeline one more time. They reconstructed the final hours. The bookstore closing. The parking lot. The vehicle. The encounter. They believed Mercer had approached Emily after she left work. They believed he used his familiarity with her to gain trust. He was not a stranger. He was someone she recognized. someone she had spoken to before. That detail made the crime even more disturbing, because the person responsible was not an unknown figure hiding in the darkness. He was someone who had existed around her life. Someone who had watched. Someone who had waited. The town of Cedar Ridge struggled with the revelation. For years, people wondered if Emily had simply disappeared. If she had left. If there was another explanation. Now they had their answer. And it was an answer nobody wanted. But the investigation was not finished. Because Daniel Mercer still had one last opportunity. To tell the truth. To explain what happened. To finally give Emily's family the closure they had waited 30 years to receive. And as detectives prepared for one final interview, they knew something had changed. The case was no longer about finding a suspect. The suspect had already been found. Now it was about uncovering every hidden moment of that cold January night. Every decision. Every lie. Every secret. Because after 3 decades, the truth was finally coming out of the shadows. For 30 years, the truth had been buried beneath silence. Not because there were no clues. Not because nobody searched. But because the most important piece of evidence was hidden inside the smallest details. A forgotten trace. A missed connection. A piece of the puzzle that had been sitting untouched while an entire community waited for answers. Now, with Daniel Mercer identified and the evidence finally connected, investigators were determined to rebuild the final hours of Emily Carter's life. Not just to prove what happened, but to understand it. Because Emily was more than a name in a cold case file. She was a daughter, a friend, a young woman with dreams that ended on a freezing night in 1989. And her family deserved to know the truth. The investigators returned to the beginning. January 14th. The night everything changed. They reconstructed every movement, every minute, every decision. Emily had closed the bookstore at approximately 10:30 p.m. The streets were nearly empty. Snow covered the sidewalks. Most businesses had already shut down. The town was quiet, almost completely silent. That silence became one of the most important details. Because investigators believed whoever approached Emily chose that moment carefully. A time when fewer people were watching. A time when help was farther away. A time when the darkness created opportunity. The question remained, why Emily? The answer came from examining Daniel Mercer's connection to her. Detectives discovered that Mercer had developed an unhealthy interest in Emily months before her disappearance. He knew her schedule. He knew where she worked. He knew when she usually left. At first, investigators believed this information came from simple conversations. But as they dug deeper, they discovered something more disturbing. Mercer had been keeping notes. Not detailed records. Not obvious plans. Just small observations. Dates. Times. Places. Tiny pieces of information that revealed he had been paying attention. Too much attention. The discovery changed how investigators viewed the entire case. Emily had not vanished randomly. This was not a sudden act of violence. This was something that had been building. Something that had been hidden beneath normal interactions. The man Emily thought was simply someone she knew from around town had been watching her life from a distance. And that realization shocked everyone involved. Because the most terrifying suspects are not always strangers. Sometimes they are familiar faces. People who blend into everyday life. People nobody thinks to question. As investigators continued examining Mercer's background, they uncovered another disturbing detail. Shortly before Emily disappeared, Mercer had asked coworkers unusual questions. He wanted to know if Emily was dating anyone, if she planned to move, if she had family nearby. At the time, nobody saw those questions as dangerous. They seemed like casual conversation. But decades later, they looked different. They looked like preparation. The evidence against Mercer continued growing. But investigators still needed to understand the moments immediately after Emily disappeared. The abandoned vehicle remained the center of the mystery. Why leave the car there? Why take the keys? Why leave behind her notebook? The answer, investigators believed, was that Mercer wanted the disappearance to look confusing. He wanted people searching in the wrong direction. A missing person case creates chaos. Every possibility must be considered. Every theory must be investigated. And that confusion gives someone time. Time to hide. Time to leave. Time to create distance. That was exactly what happened. After Emily vanished, Mercer quickly separated himself from Cedar Ridge. He moved away, changed his routine, started over. For years, nobody connected his departure to the disappearance, because there was no evidence, only suspicion. And suspicion was not enough, until DNA changed everything. The breakthrough evidence finally gave investigators the foundation they needed. But the DNA match created another challenge. Mercer knew the case was old. He knew the investigation had failed for decades. And investigators believed he was confident the past could never catch him. That confidence appeared during his final interrogation. When detectives asked him about Emily, he became defensive. He said investigators were trying to destroy his life. He said the evidence was misunderstood. He claimed the DNA could have been transferred accidentally. But investigators had heard those explanations before. They knew the difference between uncertainty and deception. And Mercer's story kept changing. The final confrontation came when detectives placed the evidence directly in front of him. The DNA, the vehicle records, the witness statements, the forgotten details from 1989. One by one, they removed every escape route. For the first time in 30 years, Mercer had nowhere left to hide. But even then, he refused to fully admit what happened. He remained silent about the exact events of that night. He refused to explain why Emily disappeared. He refused to provide the final answers her family had waited decades to hear. The investigators knew they might never get a complete confession. But they had something more powerful. The truth revealed through evidence. The truth revealed through science. The truth revealed through a detail everyone ignored. The arrest of Daniel Mercer sent shockwaves through Utah. News organizations across the country reported the case. A decades-old cold case solved. A missing woman finally found. A suspect exposed after 30 years. But for the people of Cedar Ridge, the headlines were only part of the story. They remembered Emily. They remembered the search parties, the posters, the unanswered questions, the years of wondering. Her family described the moment they learned the truth as both heartbreaking and relieving, because there was pain in knowing what happened. But there was also peace in finally ending the uncertainty. For 3 decades, they lived between hope and fear. Now they had an answer. The investigation into Emily Carter's disappearance became a reminder that no case truly disappears. Evidence waits. Memories return. And sometimes, the smallest forgotten detail can destroy the biggest lie. The clue that solved the case was not discovered by luck. It was discovered because investigators refused to stop looking. Because somewhere inside every cold case is a story waiting to be heard. A voice waiting to speak. A truth waiting to return. And in Utah, after 30 years of silence, Emily Carter's story finally came back into the light. The arrest of Daniel Mercer should have been the final moment of the investigation. For many cases, an arrest is where the story ends. A suspect identified. Evidence presented. A community finally able to move forward. But the disappearance of Emily Carter was never just about finding a name. It was about understanding how a young woman could vanish in the middle of a familiar town, leaving behind only fragments of a life interrupted. And even after Mercer was taken into custody, investigators continued searching for every missing piece. Because one question remained unanswered. What happened during those final moments between Emily leaving the bookstore and her car being discovered the next morning? The investigators returned again to the evidence. The same evidence that had been examined countless times. But now they saw it differently. The notebook, the keys, the vehicle, the fabric fragment, the tire marks. Every detail carried a different meaning. For years, the case had been viewed as a mystery. Now it was becoming a timeline that revealed how carefully Mercer had constructed his actions. Detectives believed Mercer had approached Emily shortly after she left work. He knew she recognized him. He knew she would not immediately feel threatened. That was the detail that disturbed investigators the most. There was no sign that Emily had expected danger. No sign that she believed she was walking into a nightmare. Because the person standing near her car was someone familiar. Someone she had spoken with before. Someone who had earned a level of trust. The investigation revealed that Mercer had used his position as a local mechanic to create connections throughout the community. He was the kind of person people remembered as helpful, quiet, reliable, the kind of person nobody imagined could be connected to a crime. And that image protected him. For decades, neighbors who knew Mercer struggled to accept the truth. They described him as ordinary, someone who went to work, someone who kept to himself, someone who never attracted attention. But investigators knew something important. A person's public image does not always reveal their private actions. And cold cases often remain unsolved because people cannot imagine the person responsible. The evidence continued to expose the gap between who Mercer appeared to be and who he really was. Investigators discovered that shortly after Emily disappeared, Mercer had changed his behavior. He became distant. He avoided conversations about the case. He stopped spending time in places where people might ask questions. At the time, nobody considered it suspicious. People grieve differently. People react differently. But decades later, those changes became another piece of the pattern. The investigation also revealed that Mercer had followed news coverage of Emily's disappearance closely. He knew what police had discovered. He knew what information had been released. He knew what investigators were looking for. And detectives believed that knowledge allowed him to stay ahead of the investigation. He knew what mistakes had been made. He knew what evidence had been collected. And he knew what evidence had not. That became one of the most chilling discoveries in the entire case. Mercer had not simply escaped detection. He had adapted. Every time investigators moved in one direction, he adjusted. Every time rumors spread, he stayed silent. Every time the community demanded answers, he waited. And time became his greatest weapon. But time also became the thing that finally destroyed him. Because while memories faded, science improved. While witnesses forgot details, evidence remained. The same technology that did not exist in 1989 was now powerful enough to reveal what had been hidden. The DNA evidence was the turning point. The one overlooked detail that changed everything. But investigators soon realized the DNA was only the beginning. The evidence did more than identify Mercer. It confirmed a connection that had existed all along. A connection between the suspect and the night Emily disappeared. A connection that had been invisible until modern science exposed it. The case moved toward trial preparation. Prosecutors carefully organized decades of evidence. They reviewed every report, every photograph, every interview. They knew the defense would challenge the timeline. They knew they would question the reliability of old evidence. They knew they would argue that 30 years created too many uncertainties. But prosecutors believed the truth was stronger than time. Because the evidence was not based on one single discovery. It was based on a pattern built over decades. The DNA, the false statements, the vehicle, the witnesses, the forgotten clues. Together, they created a picture that was impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Emily's family prepared for a moment they had waited their entire lives to see. A courtroom, a public acknowledgement, a chance to finally speak about the woman behind the headlines. They did not want people to remember Emily only as a victim. They wanted people to remember who she was before the tragedy. The young woman who loved books, the person who dreamed about teaching, the daughter who called home often, the friend who made people laugh. The person whose life was much larger than the case built around her disappearance. During the first court proceedings, the courtroom was filled with emotion. Some people had waited 30 years for that moment. Others had never expected it would come. The judge looked over a case file that had survived generations. A file that had traveled through different police departments.
Different investigators. Different eras of technology.
A file that almost became another forgotten cold case. But it did not, because someone reopened it. Someone looked again. Someone noticed the detail that had been ignored. And that detail changed history. As the trial moved forward, investigators continued searching for one final thing: the complete truth. Because even with Mercer identified, there were still unanswered questions about motive. Why did he choose Emily? Why did he wait so long? Why did he continue denying involvement? The answers were hidden inside Mercer himself. And as the courtroom prepared for the next phase of the case, everyone knew one thing. After 30 years of silence, Daniel Mercer was finally going to face the consequences of the secret he had carried. The cold case that haunted Utah was no longer a mystery, but the story of Emily Carter. And the truth behind that freezing night in 1989 was not finished yet. The courtroom doors opened, and for the first time in 30 years, the name Emily Carter was no longer spoken as a mystery. It was spoken as a story. A story of a young woman whose life was taken too soon. A story of a family that refused to stop searching. A story of a cold case that survived decades of silence. And a story of how one forgotten detail finally brought the truth into the light. The trial of Daniel Mercer became one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings Utah had seen in years. Not because the evidence was simple, not because the case was easy, but because everyone wanted to understand one thing. How did someone manage to hide a secret for so long? The prosecution began by showing the jury the timeline. Not with dramatic statements, not with accusations, but with facts. January 14th, 1989. Emily Carter closes the bookstore. 10:30 p.m. She walks toward her vehicle. Minutes later, she disappears. The next morning, her car is discovered. And inside that vehicle is the evidence that would eventually expose the person responsible. The prosecutors carefully explained how the original investigation had unfolded, how detectives searched, how volunteers looked through snow-covered fields, how the community waited, how years passed without answers. Then they introduced the evidence that changed everything: the DNA. The jury saw photographs from 1989, old evidence bags, original reports, documents that had survived decades. The message was clear. The evidence had been there from the beginning. The technology was not. The prosecution argued that Daniel Mercer was not discovered because investigators suddenly became lucky. He was discovered because science finally caught up with the truth. The defense attempted to create doubt. They questioned the reliability of evidence collected decades earlier. They argued that time had damaged the investigation. They suggested that memories could not be trusted after 30 years. And those arguments were expected, because time is always the greatest challenge in a cold case. Memories fade. People move away. Records disappear. But the prosecution had prepared for that. They showed that while memories could change, DNA did not. While witnesses could forget, evidence remained. They presented the forensic experts who explained how the DNA profile connected Mercer to the evidence found in Emily's vehicle. The experts described the testing process, the careful examination, the scientific methods that transformed a forgotten sample into a direct link. The courtroom listened in silence, because everyone understood what it meant. The person responsible had not been discovered through rumor. Not through suspicion. Not through coincidence. He had been discovered through science. Then came the testimony from witnesses who had remained silent for decades. People who had carried memories of that winter night for 30 years. The former employee from Mercer's repair shop described seeing him arrive late after Emily disappeared. He remembered the damaged truck, the unusual behavior, the nervousness. Details that seemed meaningless in 1989. Details that now felt impossible to ignore. Another witness described seeing Mercer's truck near the bookstore, a memory that had been buried beneath years of uncertainty. The defense challenged those memories. They questioned why nobody came forward earlier. But the answer was painfully simple, because nobody knew what they were looking at. Nobody knew which details mattered. That was the cruel reality of the case. The clues existed, but they were scattered, waiting for someone to connect them. The most emotional moment came when Emily's family addressed the court. Her mother walked slowly to the witness stand. She held a photograph, the same photograph that had appeared on missing posters decades earlier. She did not speak about the investigation first. She spoke about Emily, about the person she was before the headlines. She described her daughter's laughter, her dreams, her kindness. She described the years of waiting, the birthdays without answers, the holidays without closure, the moments when the family wondered if Emily was still alive somewhere. Every unanswered phone call, every possible sighting, every false hope. 30 years of uncertainty. Then she looked toward Mercer, and she delivered the words the family had carried for decades. They did not need revenge. They needed the truth. They needed the world to know Emily's name, not as a cold case, not as a headline, but as a person. The courtroom remained silent. Even the people who had followed the case through the media felt the weight of that moment. Because behind every investigation file is a human life. Behind every piece of evidence is a family waiting. And behind every cold case is a story that never truly ended. When Daniel Mercer finally spoke, the courtroom expected a confession, a moment of honesty, a final explanation. But Mercer remained distant. He continued denying full responsibility. He offered no clear explanation, no apology, no answers that could repair 3 decades of pain. For the families who waited, that silence was almost as painful as the crime itself. But the evidence had already spoken. The jury did not need his confession. They had the timeline. They had the DNA. They had the witnesses. They had the pattern. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The courtroom became completely still. Everyone waited. The verdict was read.
Guilty.
A single word, but a word that carried 30 years of pain behind it. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered. Cameras flashed. The headline was everywhere. Utah 1989 cold case solved. DNA evidence exposes suspect after 3 decades. But for the people who knew Emily, the headline was not the ending. It was the beginning of healing. The investigation had answered the question of who, but it also revealed something deeper. A truth about time. A truth about evidence. A truth about justice. Because some secrets survive for years. Some lies survive for decades. But they do not survive forever. The smallest forgotten detail had waited patiently. Hidden. Silent. Until the right moment. Until the right technology. Until someone was willing to look again. And after 30 years of darkness, the truth about Emily Carter finally emerged. The verdict brought an ending to a chapter that had remained unfinished for 3 decades. But for the people of Cedar Ridge, the days after the trial were not filled with celebration. They were filled with reflection. Because solving a cold case does not erase the pain that came before it. It does not return the years that were lost. It does not bring back the conversations that never happened.
The birthdays that passed.
The memories that should have been created. For Emily Carter's family, justice came with a mixture of relief and heartbreak. They finally knew the truth. But the truth was something they had spent 30 years hoping they would never have to accept. The town changed after the verdict. For years, Cedar Ridge had carried the weight of uncertainty. Every winter, every snowfall, every quiet night, people remembered the same question. What happened to Emily? Now that question had an answer. But the answer left behind a different kind of silence. Residents who had lived through the investigation remembered how the disappearance changed the community. They remembered the search parties moving through frozen fields. They remembered strangers volunteering. They remembered photographs of Emily placed in store windows. They remembered a town united by fear and hope. And they remembered the years when the case slowly disappeared from public attention. Like many cold cases, Emily's disappearance became part of the background. A file in a cabinet. A name on a list. A mystery people assumed would never be solved. But behind that file was always a person. And behind that person was a family still waiting. The investigation into Daniel Mercer became an example of how forgotten cases can return. Not because someone suddenly discovers a magical clue. Not because one person solves everything overnight. But because old evidence can gain new meaning. The overlooked detail that changed the case was not powerful in 1989. It was ordinary. Almost invisible. Something investigators had collected because they followed procedure. But decades later, that same detail became the bridge between the past and the present. It became the connection between a crime scene and a suspect, between a question and an answer, between a family's pain and a moment of justice. For the detectives who reopened the case, the investigation became personal. They had inherited a mystery created before many of them joined law enforcement. They had inherited old reports, old photographs, old interviews, a case filled with unanswered questions. But they treated it as if it happened yesterday. They studied every page, every piece of evidence, every forgotten note, because they knew something important. A cold case is never truly cold. It is only waiting, waiting for new technology, waiting for someone to notice what everyone else missed. The detectives later admitted that the most difficult part of the investigation was not finding evidence. It was believing there was still evidence to find. 30 years creates doubt. It creates distance. It creates the feeling that the truth may have disappeared forever. But Emily's case proved that time does not always destroy the answers. Sometimes time protects them. Sometimes time preserves the smallest details until the moment they are needed. The final investigation report revealed how many pieces had eventually come together. The DNA evidence, the witness accounts, the vehicle records, the inconsistent statements, the hidden connections. No single clue solved the case alone. The truth emerged because every detail finally pointed in the same direction. That was the lesson investigators wanted people to remember. A case is not solved by one discovery. It is solved when every unanswered question begins leading toward the same truth. Years after the trial, Emily's story continued to be remembered. Not because of the crime, but because of the person she was. Her photograph was no longer displayed as a missing person. It was displayed as a reminder of a life. A reminder that every name in a cold case file belongs to someone. Someone loved. Someone remembered. Someone whose story deserves to be told. The old bookstore where Emily worked became one of the places people visited when remembering her. The building had changed over the years. The streets had changed. The town had changed. But the memory remained. People still remembered the young woman who walked those streets in 1989. The woman who loved books. The woman who had plans. The woman whose disappearance created a mystery that lasted 30 years. And the woman whose story eventually helped prove something investigators had always believed. No matter how much time passes, the truth leaves traces. The final years of the investigation also changed how local law enforcement approached unsolved cases. Old evidence was reviewed. Previous assumptions were questioned. Files that had been untouched for years were reopened. Because Emily Carter's case showed that a forgotten piece of evidence could become the most important evidence. A detail dismissed decades earlier could become the key to justice. And somewhere across the country, hundreds of other cold cases remained waiting. Waiting for someone to look again. Waiting for technology to catch up. Waiting for one overlooked detail to finally speak. The story of Emily Carter ended with an arrest. A conviction. A final answer. But the shadow of that January night never completely disappeared. Because some cases leave marks deeper than court records. They remain in the memories of communities. They remain in the hearts of families. They remain as reminders of the lives interrupted and the questions that refused to die. 30 years after Emily disappeared, the silence was finally broken. The evidence had finally spoken. The mystery had finally ended. And the person who believed he could hide forever learned the truth that investigators had never forgotten. Time may slow justice. Time may hide the answers. But time does not erase the truth. And in the mountains of Utah, after 3 decades of uncertainty, the cold case that haunted a town finally reached its final chapter. For decades, The disappearance of Emily Carter existed in a space between hope and heartbreak, a place where families wait, where investigators search, where communities remember, a place where every unanswered question feels heavier with every passing year. But after the conviction of Daniel Mercer, the case entered a new stage. The stage where investigators looked beyond the arrest, beyond the courtroom, beyond the headlines. They looked at the damage left behind. The lives changed. The people who carried the weight of the mystery for 30 years. Because solving a case is not only about finding the person responsible. It is about understanding what was lost. And in Emily Carter's case, the loss was felt far beyond one family. The entire community had changed the night she disappeared. Before January 14, 1989, Cedar Ridge was the kind of town where people left their doors unlocked, where neighbors knew each other, where familiar faces brought comfort. But after Emily vanished, something shifted. People became more cautious, more suspicious, more aware that danger could exist in ordinary places. The case became a warning, a reminder that appearances could be deceiving. And for many residents, that was the hardest truth to accept. The person responsible was not a stranger hiding somewhere unknown. He was someone who had walked the same streets, someone who had spoken with people every day, someone who had been part of the community. The investigation revealed how easily a person could hide behind normal behavior. Daniel Mercer was not someone who looked like a threat. He did not fit the image people expected. That was one reason the case remained unsolved for so long. People searched for a monster, but they overlooked the ordinary person standing nearby. The detectives who worked the case later explained that this was one of the most difficult parts. Human beings naturally look for obvious signs. They expect dangerous people to look dangerous. They expect suspicious behavior to be easy to recognize. But reality is different. Sometimes the truth is hidden behind routine, behind familiar conversations, behind a person everyone believes they understand. The final investigation also revealed new details about Emily herself. After her disappearance, many people remembered only the tragedy. But the cold case team wanted to restore the full picture. They collected stories from friends and family. They gathered photographs. They reviewed old journals. They wanted the world to know Emily before she became a headline. She was not just the woman from a missing poster. She was a person with a future. A person who laughed loudly. A person who cared deeply about others. A person who believed the world was full of possibilities. Her friends described how she would spend hours reading in quiet corners of bookstores. How she photographed abandoned buildings because she believed forgotten places still had stories. How she dreamed about becoming a teacher because she wanted to help young people find their own paths. Those details mattered because they showed what had been taken. Not just a life, a future. Years after the trial, the investigators continued receiving messages from people connected to the case. Some were from residents who had remembered additional details. Some were from people who admitted they had ignored their own instincts decades earlier. They all shared the same feeling, regret. The painful thought that maybe they could have done something differently. Maybe they could have noticed something. Maybe they could have asked one more question. But investigators reminded them of the reality. In 1989, nobody had the complete picture. They were looking through a fog. The evidence was incomplete. The technology was limited. The truth was hidden. The people involved could not know what they know now. That was the tragedy of cold cases. The answers often become obvious only after they are found. The overlooked detail that solved Emily's case became a symbol of that reality. A reminder that every piece of evidence matters. Every interview matters. Every small observation matters. Because a clue that seems meaningless today may become the key tomorrow. The case also changed Daniel Mercer's life forever. The man who spent decades believing he had escaped the past became a prisoner of it. Every interview, every report, every piece of evidence, everything he tried to leave behind returned. The secret he protected for 30 years became the evidence that exposed him. And the one thing he underestimated was time. He believed time would weaken the case. Instead, time created the technology that solved it. He believed memories would disappear. Instead, new investigators preserved them. He believed evidence would become useless. Instead, science transformed it. The final days of the investigation were filled with a strange contradiction. A case that had once seemed impossible was now clear. A mystery that had defined a town was finally solved. But the answer brought sadness instead of celebration. Because everyone understood something important. A solved case does not mean a happy ending. Sometimes justice arrives carrying pain with it. Sometimes the truth is both a relief and a wound. For Emily's family, the years after the verdict were about remembering, not forgetting. They created traditions to honor her. They shared stories about her life. They kept her memory alive. Because they refused to allow the crime to become the only thing people remembered. Emily Carter was not a cold case. She was not a headline. She was not just a victim. She was a daughter, a friend, a person who mattered. And that became the final message of the investigation. Behind every unsolved case is a human story. Behind every piece of evidence is a person waiting for justice. Behind every forgotten file is someone who deserves to be remembered. The Utah cold case that began with a disappearance in the snow ended with a discovery hidden in the smallest detail. A trace. A connection. A truth that survived 30 years. And as the town of Cedar Ridge continued moving forward, one lesson remained. The past does not disappear. It waits. It waits in evidence rooms. It waits in old photographs. It waits in memories people thought they had forgotten. And sometimes, after decades of silence, one overlooked detail is enough to bring everything back. The years after the conviction of Daniel Mercer brought something Cedar Ridge had not experienced in a long time. Silence. But it was no longer the silence of uncertainty. It was not the silence that followed unanswered questions. It was the silence that comes after the truth has finally been spoken. For 30 years, the town had lived with a mystery that followed people through their homes, through their workplaces, through their memories. A mystery that returned every winter when the snow covered the roads and the nights became colder. The disappearance of Emily Carter had become part of the identity of Cedar Ridge. People who moved away still remembered it. People who grew up afterward learned about it. Parents told their children about the case. Not to create fear, but to remember. Because Emily's story became something larger than the crime itself. It became a reminder that forgotten cases can still find answers. That families can still receive justice. That evidence can survive longer than anyone expects. The final review of the investigation revealed just how close the truth had been all along. The clues were never completely gone. They were scattered, waiting for someone to connect them. The abandoned vehicle, the anonymous phone call, the witness who remembered a dark pickup truck, the mechanic who changed his story, the damaged truck, the forgotten biological evidence. Every piece existed separately. For years, they appeared meaningless. But when investigators placed them together, they created a picture that could no longer be ignored. That was the power of the cold case investigation. It did not rewrite history. It revealed what history had been hiding. The detectives who worked the final stages of the case described the moment they realized the evidence was pointing toward Mercer. It was not one dramatic discovery. It was a gradual realization, a feeling that every unanswered question was beginning to connect. The more they looked, the more they found. The more they questioned, the more the past revealed. And eventually, the investigators reached a conclusion they could no longer avoid. The person they had been searching for had never been far away. He had been living with the secret, carrying it, protecting it, believing it would disappear with time. But time became the reason he was discovered. That was the irony of the case. The same years that seemed to protect the truth eventually exposed it. Technology changed. Investigations changed. The world changed. But the evidence remained. The overlooked detail that solved the case became a lesson taught to investigators across the region. Never dismiss what seems insignificant. Never assume an old clue has no value. Never believe a case is impossible because years have passed. Because sometimes the smallest detail is the one thing that survives. And sometimes, it is the only witness left. The impact of Emily's case reached beyond Cedar Ridge. Other cold case teams began reviewing older files. Evidence that had once been considered useless was examined again. Old photographs were studied. Old reports were reopened. New technology was applied to forgotten mysteries. Because Emily's case showed investigators something important. A case does not expire. The search for justice does not have a deadline. The passage of time may make the path harder, but it does not make the destination impossible. For Emily's family, the conclusion brought complicated emotions. There was relief. There was sadness. There was anger. There were moments when they wished the answer had come sooner. Years earlier. Before more birthdays passed. Before more memories faded. But they also felt gratitude. Gratitude toward the investigators who refused to abandon the case. Gratitude toward the scientists who examined evidence collected decades earlier. Gratitude toward everyone who kept Emily's name alive. Because without those people, the truth might have remained buried. The final public statement from Emily's family focused on one message. Remember the person,
not just the crime.
They wanted people to remember her dreams, her personality, her kindness. They wanted her life to be louder than the tragedy that ended it. And that became the final chapter of Emily Carter's story. Not a story about disappearance.
Not a story about fear.
But a story about perseverance. A story about the power of truth. A story about how one overlooked detail can change everything. Years after the investigation ended, the original case file remained preserved. Inside were decades of history. Photographs, documents, evidence, notes written by investigators who never got to see the final answer. Many of those officers had retired before the case was solved. Some never knew that the mystery they carried would eventually be completed. But their work mattered. Every interview, every search, every report, every piece of evidence collected in 1989 helped create the path to justice. The final investigators were not solving a new case. They were finishing an old one. They were continuing a story that began 30 years earlier. A story that survived because people refused to forget. And that may have been the most important lesson from the Utah cold case. Not every mystery is solved quickly. Not every answer comes when people want it. Sometimes justice moves slowly. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it takes decades. But as Emily Carter's case proved, the truth has a way of waiting. It waits beneath the surface. It waits inside forgotten evidence. It waits for the right moment. And when that moment arrives, even the smallest overlooked detail can become impossible to ignore. The winter night of 1989 began with a disappearance that shocked a community. It ended decades later with a truth that finally brought closure. The cold case that once seemed impossible had been solved. The unanswered questions had finally found their answers. And the name Emily Carter was no longer connected only to mystery. It was connected to justice, to remembrance, to a story that proved one undeniable fact. No matter how much time passes, the truth never truly disappears. The final chapter of Emily Carter's case was not written inside a courtroom. It was written in the quiet moments afterward, in the empty streets of Cedar Ridge, in the homes of people who had spent decades waiting, in the memories of those who still remembered the young woman who disappeared on a freezing night in January. Because even after justice was delivered, the town understood something important. A conviction can close a case, but it cannot erase history. It cannot erase the fear, the questions, the years lost. For 30 years, Emily's disappearance had existed like a shadow over the community. A shadow that followed every winter storm, every missing person report, every reminder that some answers remain hidden. But now, the shadow had a name, Daniel Mercer. And the truth that investigators uncovered revealed one of the most haunting realities of criminal investigations. Sometimes the person responsible is not hidden because there are no clues. Sometimes they are hidden because nobody knows how to see the clues yet. The evidence against Mercer had been built over decades. Not through one discovery. Not through one confession, but through patience, through persistence, through the belief that the past still had something to say. The final investigators reviewed the original case files one more time after the trial. They found handwritten notes from detectives who worked the case in 1989. Notes filled with questions. Questions that had no answers at the time. One sentence appeared repeatedly throughout the documents. Something does not fit. Those words represented the frustration investigators felt decades earlier. They knew something was wrong. They knew Emily had not simply disappeared. They knew someone held information, but they could not prove it. The technology did not exist. The evidence was incomplete. The answers were trapped inside details that nobody could yet understand. That was the tragedy of the original investigation. The detectives were not careless. They were fighting against the limits of their time. They collected what they could. They followed every lead available. They searched every location they believed mattered. They interviewed everyone connected to Emily. They did everything they could. But some truths require time before they can be uncovered. And time eventually brought the breakthrough. The DNA evidence that changed the case became more than just scientific proof. It became a symbol of everything that had been missed. A reminder that evidence does not always reveal its importance immediately. A fingerprint can wait. A photograph can wait. A biological sample can wait. The truth can wait. But it does not disappear. That was the message investigators repeated when speaking about the case. They wanted families of other missing people to understand one thing. A cold case is not a forgotten case. It is an unfinished case. And unfinished cases can still find endings. After the trial, Emily's name returned to the places where it belonged. Not just in police reports, not just in news articles, but in conversations. People began sharing stories about her again. Friends who had not spoken publicly in years remembered small moments. The way she smiled, the way she listened, the way she made ordinary days feel special. Those memories became important because they restored something the crime had taken away. Emily's identity. For years, the world knew her because of what happened to her. Now people remembered who she was. The young woman before the tragedy. The person with hopes. The person with dreams. The person whose life mattered. The final investigation also revealed something disturbing about the way Mercer maintained his secret. He did not hide because he was invisible. He hid because he believed nobody would look again. He believed the passage of time would protect him. He believed old evidence would remain old forever. That belief became his greatest mistake, because every year that passed brought new possibilities, new technology, new investigators, new ways of seeing the same evidence. The detail that solved Emily's case had been there for decades, waiting. And when investigators finally looked at it with new eyes, everything changed. The case became a powerful example of how modern forensic science has transformed criminal investigations. A crime scene from the past can still speak. An old piece of evidence can still reveal a secret. A forgotten clue can still expose a person who thought they had escaped forever. For the Cedar Ridge community, the lesson was unforgettable. Justice may arrive late, but late justice is still justice. The winter night that began with fear ended with answers. The disappearance that created decades of uncertainty ended with the truth. And the person who believed the secret would remain buried discovered something that investigators had known all along. Secrets leave traces. Even the smallest ones. Especially the smallest ones. The final image many people remembered from the case was not the courtroom. Not the arrest. Not the headlines. It was something much quieter. A photograph of Emily Carter smiling. A reminder of the person at the center of the story. A reminder that behind every investigation is someone who mattered. Someone loved. Someone missed. Someone whose story deserves to continue. And that was the final legacy of the Utah 1989 cold case. Not only that a suspect was found, not only that evidence revealed the truth, but that one overlooked detail proved something investigators had always believed. The truth may be delayed. It may be buried. It may be hidden beneath decades of silence. But it never truly disappears. Because eventually, someone will look again. And when they do, the smallest forgotten clue can become the voice of someone who has been waiting 30 years to be heard. The story of Emily Carter did not end when the courtroom emptied. It did not end when the verdict was announced. Because some cases continue living long after the final legal documents are signed. They remain in the memories of the people who searched, the people who waited, the people who never stopped asking questions. For Cedar Ridge, Emily's disappearance had been more than an investigation. It had been a wound that stayed open through changing seasons, changing generations, and changing faces. The town grew older while the mystery remained frozen in time. Children who were young when Emily vanished became adults. Adults who once searched the fields became grandparents. Detectives who first opened the case retired. New officers took their place. But one thing remained unchanged: the desire to know the truth. And when the truth finally arrived, it carried a powerful reminder. No case is ever truly forgotten as long as someone remembers the person behind it. The final review of the investigation uncovered just how many lives had been touched by Emily's disappearance. The volunteers who walked through snow-covered landscapes, the officers who searched abandoned roads, the friends who kept her photograph, the family members who refused to accept silence. All of them had carried a piece of the story. All of them had kept the case alive. The investigation into Daniel Mercer also revealed the importance of never ignoring small details. Because the detail that eventually exposed him was not dramatic. It was not something from a movie. There was no hidden confession letter, no secret recording, no unexpected witness appearing from nowhere. The truth came from something much simpler. A piece of evidence that had been waiting quietly for science to catch up. That was what made the case so unforgettable. The solution was not found because the past changed. The solution was found because people learned how to look at the past differently. The investigators who reopened the file approached it without assumptions. They did not believe they already knew what happened. They did not believe the original investigation failed. They understood that every investigation is limited by the tools and knowledge available at the time. So they asked different questions. They examined old answers. They searched through forgotten information. And eventually, they discovered what had been hidden in plain sight. The final report described the case as a lesson in patience, not just for law enforcement, but for families across the country waiting for answers. Because thousands of families live with the same uncertainty Emily's family experienced. Years without explanations. Years wondering. Years hoping. For them, the resolution of Emily's case became a message. A reminder that impossible does not always mean forever. The aftermath of the trial also changed the way the community viewed the people around them. For years, residents believed danger came from somewhere outside. From strangers. From unknown threats. But Emily's story showed something far more complicated. Sometimes the greatest danger is hidden behind familiarity, behind a friendly conversation, behind a person who seems ordinary. That realization was painful, because it forced people to reconsider memories they thought they understood, moments they once considered harmless, interactions they never questioned. The case changed the way Cedar Ridge looked at the past. Every old memory became something worth examining. Every forgotten conversation became a possible clue. Not because people wanted to live in fear, but because they understood now that details matter. After the investigation ended, the evidence room where Emily's case file had been stored became a symbol of something larger. Inside were decades of unanswered questions, decades of waiting, decades of hope, but also decades of determination. The file represented everyone who refused to give up. Every detective, every scientist, every person who searched, every family member who kept saying Emily's name. Because names matter. They prevent people from becoming forgotten. They remind the world that every case involves a real person, a real life, a real story. The final years of Emily's case also brought attention to other unresolved disappearances. Families reached out to investigators. Cold case units received renewed funding. Old evidence was reviewed. New technology was applied. because one solved case created hope for many others. If Emily Carter's truth could survive 30 years, then maybe other truths could survive too. That became the greatest impact of the investigation. Not only solving one mystery, but proving that mysteries can still be solved. The night Emily disappeared began with uncertainty. A locked door, a silent street, an empty vehicle, a family waiting for a phone call that never came. But 30 years later, that same story ended with something different. An answer, a conviction, a reminder that justice can move slowly, but it can still arrive. And perhaps the most chilling part of the entire case was not the crime itself. It was the fact that the person responsible believed he had defeated time. He believed the years would protect him. He believed the world would forget. But he underestimated the one thing that cold case investigators never forget. Evidence remembers. It does not grow old. It does not lose its voice. It waits. And when the moment arrives,
it speaks.
The final headline that once shocked Utah became a permanent reminder. Utah 1989 cold case solved. One overlooked detail exposes suspect. A headline that represented 30 years of pain. 30 years of searching. 30 years of unanswered questions. But also 30 years of determination. Because the truth was never gone. It was simply waiting for someone to find it. And in the end, the smallest overlooked detail became the thing that changed everything. The thing that brought justice. The thing that finally allowed a family to stop searching. The thing that gave Emily Carter's story the ending it deserved. The years continued to pass after the final verdict, but Emily Carter's name never disappeared. It remained carved into the memory of Cedar Ridge. Not as a symbol of fear. Not only as the victim of a terrible crime, but as a reminder of the power of persistence. Because the most important part of the case was never just the arrest of Daniel Mercer. The most important part was what happened before that moment. The decades of searching. The decades of waiting. The decades when the answer seemed impossible. Cold cases are often measured by time. 5 years. 10 years. 20 years. 30 years. But time is not what defines them. What defines them is the question that refuses to die. And Emily's case had one question that remained alive longer than anyone expected. What really happened that night? The final investigation attempted to reconstruct not only the evidence, but the emotions surrounding those last hours. Investigators wanted to understand Emily's experience. Not just the actions of the person responsible. They studied her final day. They spoke with people who saw her. They examined her routines. They rebuilt the ordinary moments before everything changed. Because that was one of the most haunting parts of the case. The final day of Emily's life began like any other. A normal morning. A normal workday. Normal conversations. Normal plans. Nobody around her knew they were witnessing the final ordinary moments she would ever have. That is what makes cases like Emily's so powerful. The line between normal life and tragedy is often invisible. One moment everything is familiar. The next moment everything changes. The investigation revealed that Emily had no reason to believe danger was waiting for her. She walked through the same streets she had walked hundreds of times before. She went to the same place where people knew her.
She followed the same routine.
And that routine was exactly what allowed someone else to predict her movements. The person responsible understood her habits. He understood her schedule. He understood when she would be alone. That realization became one of the most disturbing conclusions of the investigation. The crime was not a random moment. It was the result of observation, planning, patience. And that was what investigators believed allowed Mercer to remain hidden for so long. He counted on people searching for a stranger. He counted on people overlooking someone familiar. He counted on time. But time eventually turned against him. The same years that separated him from the crime also preserved the evidence. The same years that made witnesses uncertain also created new technology. The same years that made the case seem impossible eventually made it solvable. That was the strange contradiction of cold case investigations. Sometimes the passage of time creates obstacles. Sometimes it creates opportunities. For Emily's case, it created both. The investigators who solved the case understood they were standing at the end of a journey that began long before they arrived. They were not the first people searching for answers. They were simply the people who finally had the tools to find them. They respected the work of the original detectives, because without that early investigation, there would have been nothing to reopen. No evidence. No reports.
No timeline.
No path back to the truth. Every person who touched the case contributed something, even those who never saw the final result. That became one of the most important lessons from Emily's story. Justice is often built by many people across many years. Some plant the seeds. Others see them grow. But every effort matters. The final evidence review also showed how fragile the line between a solved case and an unsolved case can be. If one piece of evidence had been discarded, if one report had been lost, if one investigator had decided not to look again, the outcome could have been completely different. That reality changed how many people viewed old investigations. Because sometimes the difference between a mystery and an answer is one overlooked detail, one question, one decision, one person willing to try again. Years later, detectives involved in the case still remembered the moment they realized the investigation was finally moving. Not because they found a dramatic confession, not because someone revealed a secret, but because the evidence finally created a clear path. A path that had been hidden for decades. And at the center of that path was Emily, the person whose story had been waiting to be told. The community eventually created memorials in her honor. Small reminders throughout Cedar Ridge. Places where people could stop, reflect, remember. Because memory was important. Without memory, cold cases disappear. Without people who remember, evidence loses its purpose. Without families who continue asking questions, answers may never come. Emily's story became proof that remembering matters. The final message from investigators was simple. Do not underestimate the past. Do not assume an old case has no future. Do not believe that time destroys every secret. Because sometimes the past is not silent. Sometimes it is waiting. Waiting in old photographs. Waiting in forgotten records. Waiting inside evidence collected decades earlier. Waiting for the moment when someone finally understands what it means. And when that moment arrives, a cold case can become a solved case. A mystery can become an answer. A question can finally become peace. The winter of 1989 began with a disappearance that shocked Utah. It ended decades later with a truth that could no longer be hidden. Daniel Mercer believed he had escaped the consequences of his actions. He believed the years would protect him. He believed the world would forget Emily Carter. But he was wrong, because some names are never forgotten. Some stories are never abandoned. And some truths, no matter how deeply buried, always find their way back to the surface. The final pages of the investigation file carried a strange feeling. Not the feeling of victory. Not the feeling of celebration. But the feeling of something finally being complete. For 30 years, the case of Emily Carter existed without an ending. A story that stopped in the middle. A question without an answer. A family trapped between hope and grief. But now, the silence had been broken. The evidence had spoken. The truth had returned. And the people who spent decades searching finally understood what had happened on that frozen January night. But even after everything was revealed, one question remained in the minds of investigators. How had Daniel Mercer managed to hide for so long? The answer was not simple. It was not because he was smarter than everyone else. It was not because he had erased every trace. It was because time created distance. And distance created doubt. 30 years gave him a new life, a different identity, a world where few people remembered the name Emily Carter, a world where the old investigations seemed like something from another era. That was what made the discovery so shocking. The person connected to the crime had not vanished. He had simply moved forward. He had built a routine. He had created a normal appearance. And every ordinary day that passed made the secret easier to carry. But investigators discovered something important. Secrets are heavy. They change the way people behave. They leave small signs, small mistakes, small moments where the truth almost escapes. Throughout the years, Mercer had avoided discussing Emily. He avoided questions about the case. He avoided places where memories could return. At the time, nobody noticed. But after the investigation reopened, those choices became impossible to ignore. Investigators began studying Mercer's life after 1989. They looked at where he lived, where he worked,
who he contacted,
where he traveled. They were searching for one thing, a connection, a sign that the past had followed him. And they found it. Even after leaving Cedar Ridge, Mercer continued carrying pieces of the old crime with him. Not physical evidence, but behavior, patterns, habits. The same careful nature that helped him avoid suspicion also revealed something else. He was always controlling information, always choosing what people knew, always deciding what questions could be answered. That pattern matched the night Emily disappeared. A night where investigators believed control was everything. Control of the situation, control of the evidence,
control of the story.
But the one thing Mercer could not control was the future. He could not control advancements in science. He could not control investigators reopening the case. He could not control the fact that someone would eventually look closer. That was the mistake that ended everything. He believed the evidence was frozen in 1989. But evidence does not stay trapped in one moment. Technology moves forward. Knowledge expands. Old discoveries gain new meaning. The same piece of evidence that seemed useless decades earlier became the foundation of the entire case. That single overlooked detail became the thread investigators followed until the entire truth was uncovered. And once they pulled that thread, everything began falling apart. The old statements, the old explanations, the old excuses. They could no longer survive against the evidence. For the people who investigated the case, the most powerful moment was not the arrest. It was the realization that Emily had finally been heard. For 30 years, she had no voice. No way to explain what happened. No way to identify the person responsible. But the evidence became her voice. Every mark, every trace, every forgotten piece of information. Together, they told a story that had waited decades to be understood. The final days of the investigation brought investigators back to the places where Emily's story began. The bookstore, the streets, the roads outside Cedar Ridge. They walked through those locations again, not searching anymore, remembering. They imagined the young woman who had walked those same paths in 1989. A woman who had no idea that her disappearance would become one of the town's greatest mysteries. A woman whose name would remain alive because people refused to stop looking. The investigators knew that solving the case did not change what happened. It could not undo the tragedy. But it changed something equally important. It changed the way Emily's story would be remembered. For years, the question had been, where is Emily Carter? Now, the question became, who was Emily Carter? And that was the question her family wanted people to ask. Because a person should never be remembered only by the worst moment of their life. Emily was more than the night she disappeared. She was more than a case number. She was more than evidence. She was a person whose dreams mattered, whose future mattered, whose story mattered. The Utah cold case became a reminder that behind every investigation is someone waiting for justice. Someone whose name deserves to be spoken. Someone whose story deserves to reach the end. And after 30 years, Emily Carter finally had that ending. The case that once seemed impossible had been solved. The suspect who believed he was protected by time had been exposed. And the smallest overlooked detail had done what decades of searching could not. It revealed the truth. Because sometimes the answer is not hidden in the biggest clue. Sometimes it is hidden in the smallest one. The detail nobody notices. The evidence nobody expects. The piece everyone walks past. Until one day, someone finally stops. Someone finally looks closer. And everything changes. The story of Emily Carter became something that reached far beyond one courtroom, one town, or one investigation. It became a reminder of the invisible battles fought inside cold case units across the country. Cases where families wait decades. Cases where investigators chase fragments. Cases where answers seem to disappear into time. Because every cold case begins the same way, with a moment when everything changes. A person leaves home. A phone call is never returned. A door never opens again. A family realizes something is wrong. And suddenly, an ordinary day becomes the beginning of a mystery. For Emily, that moment came on a freezing night in January 1989. A night that started like any other. A night that nobody in Cedar Ridge believed would become a story told for generations. But it did. And the reason it survived was because people refused to let her become just another forgotten name. The final investigation into Emily's disappearance revealed another important truth. Cold cases are not solved only by evidence. They are solved by people. People who remember. People who search. People who refuse to accept that an unanswered question is the same thing as a lost answer. The investigators who reopened Emily's case understood the weight they carried. They were not simply reviewing an old file. They were reopening someone's life. Every photograph represented a moment that once mattered. Every interview represented someone who had carried memories for decades. Every piece of evidence represented a possibility that Emily's family might finally receive closure. That responsibility shaped the entire investigation. They approached every detail with patience. They questioned everything, even the things that seemed obvious. Especially the things that seemed obvious. Because the biggest mistake in any investigation is believing the truth must be complicated. Sometimes the truth is hidden in something simple. A small trace. A forgotten record. A detail that everyone saw but nobody understood. That was exactly what happened in Emily's case. The evidence that exposed Mercer had been there since the beginning. But in 1989, nobody knew what it could become. Nobody knew that decades later, science would transform it into the key that unlocked the mystery. That was the strange power of forensic evidence. It does not need a voice to tell a story. It does not need a witness standing in a courtroom. It simply waits. And when the right tools arrive, it reveals what happened. The final years of the investigation also changed how many people viewed Daniel Mercer. Before the evidence, he was remembered by many as an ordinary man. A mechanic. A neighbor. Someone who blended into the background. But investigators discovered that ordinary appearances can hide extraordinary secrets. The most dangerous people are not always the ones who attract attention. Sometimes they are the ones who avoid it. The ones who appear harmless. The ones who make people lower their guard. That realization was one of the most painful parts of Emily's case. Because it forced the community to accept that the person responsible had been nearby all along. Not a stranger. Not someone passing through town. Someone familiar. Someone who understood the community. Someone who understood Emily's routine. The final evidence reconstruction showed how carefully Mercer had relied on people underestimating him. He depended on assumptions. He depended on time. He depended on the belief that an old case would eventually disappear. But he misunderstood one thing. Investigators change. Technology changes. But the search for truth does not. The people working on Emily's case decades later were connected to the original investigation by one purpose. Finding answers. That purpose survived every obstacle. It survived changing investigators. Changing technology. Changing generations. It survived because Emily's family continued asking the same question. What happened to her? And eventually, that question received an answer. Not the answer anyone wanted, but the answer they deserved. The final moments of the investigation were emotional for everyone involved. The detectives who worked the case knew they were closing a chapter that had been open longer than many of them had been in law enforcement. The family knew they were finally leaving behind the uncertainty that had controlled their lives. The community knew they could finally stop wondering. But everyone also understood something. Closure does not mean forgetting. Closure means remembering without searching. Remembering without wondering. Remembering without asking if the truth will ever come. Emily's story became complete. not because the tragedy disappeared. And that difference mattered. Years after the case was solved, people continued sharing Emily's story. They shared it because it represented hope. Hope for families still waiting. Hope for investigators still searching. Hope for cases that appear impossible. Because Emily's case proved that time does not always win. Sometimes, time is simply the road the truth takes before arriving. The final message from investigators remained the same. Look again.
Search again. Question again.
Because the answer may already exist. It may be sitting inside an old file. Inside a forgotten photograph. Inside evidence that nobody thought would matter. And someday, someone may discover what others missed. The Utah 1989 cold case was solved because one overlooked detail finally revealed what had been hidden for 30 years. A detail that transformed uncertainty into truth. A detail that gave a family answers. A detail that proved justice can survive even the longest silence. And as Cedar Ridge moved forward, one thing remained certain. Emily Carter was never forgotten. Her story was never abandoned. And the truth she waited 3 decades to reveal finally had its moment.